When you think about military actions of the Spanish Civil War, the mind conjures images of battles fought in the blistering heat of the day, or desperate bands of men and women sniping each other in the hills. But there were some naval actions, often fought in the Mediterranean Sea, and with the exception of the Battle of Cape Palos, would all end in nationalist victory. But the day shots were fired off the coast of Norfolk is often a forgotten story. As covered in a video in the past, East Anglia has another connection to the Spanish Civil War, with one of the commanders of the British battalion, Fred Copeman, coming from Beccles in Suffolk. When the coup of July 1936 that would lead to the Spanish Civil War broke out, the Republican Navy stayed much more loyal to the Republic than other branches of the military, especially in eastern Spain, with crews rising up and taking over ships from officers they believed were on the side of the coup. During this, many top officers in the Navy were killed or imprisoned, regardless of political affiliation, leading to the Republican Navy having to operate with about 5% of the top officers it had before the war. But in the north and the south of Spain, the nationalist rebels were successful in capturing the major ports of Ferro and Cadiz, taking many ships for their own uses, including the formidable heavy cruiser Canarias. The Republic may have had the men, but with better ships, more experienced officers, and the aid of the Italian and German military, it is no surprise that the nationalist Navy soon had the upper hand in the Mediterranean, forcing ships who flew the Republican flag to head further north for safety. Among them, the SS Cantabria. Built in 1919 at the J. Coughlin & Sons shipyards in Vancouver, Canada, she was launched under the name War Chief. Purchased by A.F. Perez of Santander, she was then renamed to Alfonso Perez and would sail for Spain. Little is known about the majority of her service, but she was turned into a prison ship to hold defeated miners from the bloody Asturian miners' strike of 1934. This would clearly be a role she was very suited for, as in 1937 she would be commandeered by the Spanish Republic again and made a prison ship once again for a time, before being renamed Cantabria and turned into a commerce ship. Although claiming they treated both sides of the conflict in Spain equally, Britain was often hostile towards the Spanish Republic, especially in the Mediterranean, often not allowing them to buy oil for their ships in Gibraltar, something they didn't have a problem with the nationalists doing, possibly fearing a nationalist attack or invasion on Gibraltar if they did. Despite this, British shipping companies seemed to have no problem with ships under the Republican flag doing work for them. This was the case of the Cantabria on the day she was sunk. Working for the Mid-Atlantic Shipping Company, she was on her way from London to Immingham in Lincolnshire to pick up cargo bound for Leningrad in Soviet Russia. She was under the command of Captain Emmanuel Angueses, carrying a crew of 45, including 3 women and 5 children, among them the captain's wife Trinidad and his children Ramon and Veronia. Around 11:30 a.m. on the 2nd of November 1938, Captain Angueses became aware they were being shadowed by a smaller vessel that, despite changing his course, continued to follow him. He correctly had worries that this was connected to the nationalists, who had been allowed to use the port of Emden in Germany by Hitler. His officers had tried to calm his nerves after studying the ship through binoculars and reporting back that it was just a passenger steamer. In reality, the ship was the Nadir, a nationalist auxiliary cruiser disguised to look like a passenger steamer and acting as a commerce raider. The Cantabria changed course again and headed towards the Norfolk coast, possibly to try and reach the safety of British waters. But the Nadir followed and increased speed to catch her. Gaining on the Cantabria, the Nadir raised the flag of nationalist Spain, uncovered its guns, a 120mm main gun and 2 105mm secondary pieces, making them ready for action, and hailing the Cantabria to heave to or I fire. With no response from the captain, and with no sign of the ship slowing, as morning turned to afternoon, the Nadir opened fire. The Cantabria was outside of British waters, but was close enough to the coast for witnesses to see the ship being fired upon. The attack was also witnessed by 2 nearby fishing boats, who in an attempt to try and stop the shooting, both headed for the Nadir at speed with their sirens blazing, putting their lives at risk, as this could be taken as an attack itself. The Nadir, seeing no threat from fishing boats, simply pulled off the attack until they had passed, but then began to attack again. But they had brought the Cantabria precious time to get out of range of the guns. The chase continued and time ticked on, but the faster Nadir caught up once again. This time, being far more accurate with its 120mm, it put a shell through the bridge, destroying it. Now caught up with its target, the Nadir began to circle the Cantabria, firing round after round into her and spraying her with machine gun fire. The ship's wireless operator, Eduardo Calade, stayed at his post, sending off messages that the ship was being attacked by an unknown vessel. Soon, another shell came smashing in, hitting the engine room, leaving the Cantabria powerless. The engine dead and the bridge gone, and fires began to break out. Eduardo would send off an SOS, giving the ship's position at 8.5 miles southeast of the Haysboro lightship. It was 5 p.m. and getting dark when the Cromer lifeboat H.F. Bailey, commanded by coxswain Henry Blogg, a man who will have his own presentation soon, began the journey towards the danger. By now, fire had spread throughout the ship. Captain Angueses had called for the ship to be abandoned, and its 2 lifeboats had been lowered and filled with crew and the passengers. The only ones left on board was Captain Angueses, his wife and children, and the ship's steward Joaquin Valero, who believed their fate on the stricken vessel would be better than falling into the hands of the nationalists. Passing nearby were 2 freighters, a British one named Monkwood and a Norwegian vessel. They witnessed the burning ship, but were worried about coming under attack themselves if they had tried to intervene. But steaming towards the scene was the Patasonia, a British merchant ship commanded by a Captain Blackmore. He would have no such trepidation about the dangers. The Nadir had now ceased fire and was moving in to capture prisoners. Blackmore steered his ship between the Nadir and one of the lifeboats, saving 11 of the crew, but was unable to stop those on board of the second lifeboat being taken by their attackers. Among them was the wireless operator Eduardo Calade and his wife and 2 children. With their prisoners now on board, and not wanting to take the risks of collision with any of the other ships in the area, or a run-in with the Royal Navy, the Nadir made for the open sea. By 6:30 p.m. the Cromer lifeboat arrived, and after being signalled by Captain Angueses, they pulled along the starboard side of the Cantabria, which was now heavily listing. Lines were thrown to the Spanish crew, and the evacuation of those still on board the ship began, starting with the children, then the captain's wife, followed by the ship's steward, and finally, according to naval tradition, the ship's captain was the last man off. They had only just got the survivors on board when the Cantabria heeled over and damaged the lifeboat's stanchions. Fearing being dragged under as she sank, the crew quickly cut the lines attaching them to it and began to return to Cromer. As the F.H. Bailey made the trip for home, another rescue done, Captain Angueses looked back to see his ship finally slip beneath the waves. The 2 groups of survivors were unloaded in 2 separate ports, with Captain Angueses' group being landed in Cromer with the lifeboat crew, where they were put up in the Red Lion Hotel. Those saved by the Patasonia ended up in Great Yarmouth. The incident had been reported on the BBC, and local and national press descended on the area to try and get pictures of the crew, something they refused to do, fearing reprisals on either themselves or their families back in Spain. The rescue had sadly not been flawless, and there had been losses of life aboard the Cantabria, with conflicting reports claiming either just 1 member of the crew or 1 Guy had died, and others claiming up to 4 had perished in the sinking. But with everything the ship had endured over those hours, it's a miracle it was not higher. Questions were soon raised about how this incident happened, both among the public and in the Houses of Commons, with many believing it was just an unfortunate coincidence for the crew of the Cantabria. But over the next few weeks, a far more sinister truth would be unveiled. Across the sea in Denmark, after a lengthy investigation, Copenhagen police swept in and arrested a German newspaper correspondent. His name was Hunst Gustav Frederick von Pluft-Hutang, and in reality he was a spy trained by the Gestapo. When his and the paperwork of 8 other Germans and 3 Danes arrested was searched, among the maps, charts and codebooks believed to be the early stages of the plannings of invasions, they would find evidence that the group had a hand in the sinking. The sinking had been prepared and taken place on behalf of Franco, and was backed by his allies Italy and Germany, and was to serve to show the Republic that their ships were not safe anywhere, as well as to act as a warning to Britain that if they didn't stay in line, their ships would suffer the same fate. Investigators came to believe the threat to British shipping was far more a message from Germany than it was from Spain. Horst Gustav Frederick von Pluck-Huntag would be sentenced to a year in prison, but would be released after only a few months due to diplomatic pressure from Germany. He would remain a member of the German intelligence agencies until his capture by American forces in 1944. Captain Manuel Angueses and his wife and children would emigrate to Mexico after the Civil War in search of a better life. In 2006, the town of Cromer would open the Henry Blogg Lifeboat Museum. Among those who attended its opening was Raymond and Baronia, who had returned to Cromer to pay tribute to the men who'd saved their lives that night. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. This was the sinking of the SS Cantabria, Civil War off the coast, and this was a little bit of history.